What's up, dudes? Max here, and this is Ask a Pro. Big thanks to the Evo guys. They set this up, and y'all sent me a ton of questions on Twitter. Some appropriate, some not appropriate, but they picked the best ones. And I'm already seeing some really good doozies in here, so let's get to it. Babe Ruthless asks, do you feel content creation has affected your competitive drive in the genre? Thank you, Babe Ruthless. Yes, great question. So personally speaking, I haven't really been able to take fighting games on a competitive level kind of seriously since Killer Instinct 2013. And 2014 soon after, there was a moment where I realized if I don't practice for this stuff, I get kind of hard on myself. If I go to a tournament and I don't perform well, I'll have all these people like watching me and wanting me to do good. And if I like let them down and I don't do good, I feel like that kind of hit me really hard. So I focus more on the content creation side of things. Simply put, you just got to put a lot of time into these games. You need a lot of matchup knowledge. You need a lot of like execution knowledge. So having that resource just wasn't nearly as much when I'm making so many videos a day. So I kind of just dedicated myself to the content creation side of things. I applied that mentality, real life footsies, to a situation where I'm just not going to be in that bad, spot where I'm just not going to be uneducated and unprepared. That's one of my probably biggest fears, to be unprepared for something. So I was always ready for content creation. I was always ready and prepared for, the other projects I was doing. And yeah, it's kind of worked out. Uchi Gaming asks, I'd like to know if there's ever been times where you felt like giving up and what you did to overcome that. And as a creator themselves, they've been at this thing since the mid-2000s, and it's only gotten harder as time passed. So Uchi, you're right. This has only gotten more competitive and more difficult ever since the pandemic, just in general. Like everybody became a content creator. So don't feel like you're in a unique situation there. Like I feel that too. Now there's experts in every facet and avenue of the fighting game community, much less these individual games, that'll have their channels and will be established. So it's difficult to compete with that if like you have your passion and there's like 15 other people that have a very similar passion. But at the same point, I have to echo this to everybody else. As much as things got more competitive and more difficult in the content creation space, you need to find the things that make you happy. And I know you've been into this, doing this for a while, and people that are getting into this, you need to find the reasons that make you enjoy the fighting games you play, why you like them, and why you like making content around them, and to create the content you want to see. If you're looking at this vacuum of content creation, everybody's kind of doing the same thing nowadays, like me included, you kind of run into a moment where, well, why would anybody watch me particularly if you don't have a big audience? You got to find a way to branch out, and you have to find a unique idea or look in that space to discover the thing that people aren't doing. Maybe you can try doing it. True Underdog says, what does your schedule look like and how do you balance it with your family life? So this was definitely a challenge for me. Nowadays, it's not so bad. We just completed a big game project called Marvel Infinite and Beyond, and that took up a lot of time. And I realized that as I was doing it and made a conscious effort to take myself away from the project because it was so much time. But with me personally, I get my days with my family now, when that's not happening. This is how we're gonna She likes to sing, chat. Stream at nights. I have a focus editing team that I work with to get videos pumped out on the channel. But before that, there was none. I would be lucky if I took a vacation every like 2 to 3 years, and it was hyper focused on creating content. Before that, going back even further, when I was not streaming, I was making on upwards of 5 videos a day, 2 for the main channel, 3 for the secondary channels on YouTube, and definitely in that grind set mentality. I don't encourage anybody to do that, and I don't encourage you to do that if you don't already have a foundation. Like a lot of people want to jump into this thing and just do that. Not a good idea, man. You need to ease your way in, treat this as a hobby first off. But now it's a lot better. Like I try to make my work-life balance actually have a balance because, I'm a dad. And as soon as I knew I was becoming a dad, I had to get people on my side to help me out with all this video creation. So that was back in like 2020. Cinemuffin says, which fighting game artist influenced you in a creative way? If so, what piece of theirs is your favorite? Oh man. So the old school Capcom gods, I've talked about this a lot. The old school Capcom god artists are the ones that I really hang around, like Bangus, Kino Nishimura. I think if there's one game, and I was drawing these characters in high school, that really influenced me the most was Marvel vs. Capcom 1. And that game and its art style, which is, from what I understand, like Bangus did the majority of it, just has some of the most legendary visual imagery in a fighting game I've ever seen. I kind of studied that. It had a huge influence on me as an artist myself because I was an illustrator for almost my entire life until I became like content creator. Heavily influenced the way I drew and how I looked at muscles and anatomy and portrayal of characters. So MVC1 the square off picture, I'd say, the characters like in profile looking at each other, I think is one of the greatest pieces of fighting game art ever. King Raichu says, in the early days of YouTube content creation, were you ever nervous? Did you believe there were times where you would never make it this far? Did you ever think of stopping? Yes, yes, and yes. Self-doubt is definitely a thing that like plagues creative people. I'm always trying to prove to myself whether or not I am good enough to do this or whether or not the things that I'm making is good. And the majority of my YouTube career when we were making a lot of those videos was just to one-up everything over and over again because I convinced myself the previous things we did were just awful, even though a lot of people really liked them. Out of that mentality, a little destructive, you know, that could be a little rough to deal with. But for me personally, yes, there were absolutely moments where I never thought we would make it this far. I feel like this is the peak and I'm happy here. And I'm kind of treated a lot of my life that way, where at moments where I was trying to like expand audience and get subscribers or anything like that, there'd be a period where I kind of would ask myself, when is enough enough? Is it ever going to be enough? And I still juggle with that today. But at the same point, there was an active moment where I started making content for myself, where I started specifically playing the games that I was interested in, specifically playing the games the way that I was interested in, and not trying to prove myself to a certain subsect of the community or a certain side of the audience. It just wasn't important anymore. I think the content got a lot more relaxed and laid back, and I had to learn that. But for anybody that's watched, yeah, there's been several periods of me making YouTube videos or live streams or movies or events where things have changed a lot, and that's just because I have changed a lot over the years too. Yeah, to answer your question, was I ever nervous? Was I ever not aware of what I was doing and trying to do things and no clue what's going on? Yes, like that is an active thing that I still juggle with, but try not to deal with nearly as much nowadays. FemShep, what's the best thing a YouTube channel under 10,000 subscribers can do to grow its audience? I'll give you a personal note. Stop thinking of your subscriber count as being something substantial, because that has changed in YouTube. As we understand the way YouTube works now, having a sub count doesn't really mean much nowadays. And even I have like 1.7 million subscribers. I'm not bragging. I'm saying that doesn't matter nearly as much because the way YouTube spits out videos to people is completely different. The way you engage your subscribers is completely different than how it was. Most people don't go to sub feeds anymore. So if you're just able to make something that grabs the algorithm, that grabs what is currently trending or popular in this space, that's kind of how it works. The challenge is, as I said earlier, you're competing with like 10,000 other channels that are doing the same thing. So that's where you kind of branch out. And yeah, good content does rise to the top when it comes to YouTube. People will make some stuff and it will eventually teeter out, but I've seen some channels that just make a really cool fighting game video. They have like 2,000 subs and all of a sudden their videos got like hundreds of thousands of views because it eventually caught. It was interesting enough and it worked. So that's the thing. Don't look at your subscriber count as a boon or a benefit to the channel at times. You almost look at that as just like a healthy number of, maybe this many people are interested. You really just got to create captivating content for that platform. And if it's YouTube, it works a lot different than it used to. Oh God, there's a lot on here. Robomori asked, what is my proudest achievement as a content creator? For me personally, it's kind of the moments where we get recognition of some kind. The Evo Award, the Canon Award back in 2015 was bewildering and shocking, and realized that we actually had an audience that reached that many people. The Streamer Awards, the Legacy Award was huge, and I once again had no idea, and people just kind of want my reaction to this stuff when it happens. That means a lot because I'm at least getting acknowledgement from our peers, from like the folks that are around us, that there's an acknowledgement, oh, we had an impact on this scene, this space, this broadcasting type, whatever. I think in a personal term, there were some ideas and some concepts we had back in like the mid 2010s that I was like, this would be so cool if we got to pull this off. And it was kind of the live action Assist Me stuff. It was the tournament for Ultimate Marvel 3 during the pandemic that used like Parsec, and we had like an Assist Me happening. Having to integrate fictional characters into like a live setting, but still have it be scripted and acted and performed like it's almost a stage play from the comfort of your own home was extremely cool. And it very much brought me back to a space where I was at a much younger age when I wasn't into like acting or performing or anything, but my parents were, and my parents were actors, and I was on theater sets a lot. And I feel like a lot of that showed up. That experience, all that know-how that I learned on the offhand kind of made those shows and those bits much better. So yeah, I think for me personally, like the Alien movie, the Predator one, and our return to Assist Me with the Marvel characters was pretty awesome. Katsuki Rook. What's the toughest part about being a fighting game centered content creator? So the hardest thing about being a fighting game centered content creator is that we are focused on a community that is relatively niche, right? The amount of people that are into fighting games, it feels like it's getting bigger, and it is, but the amount of people that are into fighting games and that space that we share with folks that are actively looking forward to new fighting games or want to look up old ones or are looking to become really good at existing ones is small. And that can be kind of separated into different like subsects where we look at the larger space of the audience and we have to realize, who are we appealing to? Is it going to be specifically hardcore players, people that just want to do good, people over 1800 MR, you know, that kind of stuff? Realizing and identifying that and creating your space is challenging. It can be very difficult. And I think, like I said earlier, creating unique content, having an idea, fulfilling something in either one of those spaces that is what you're interested in, or that is what you're passionate about, or has not been done before, can be very difficult. Like that, for many people, is going to be one of the biggest challenges. So yeah, fighting game content creation is cool. It doesn't inherently come with a billion subscribers if all of a sudden you just make it. There's never been an opportunity in my history of content creation where I just like explode, where, oh man, all of a sudden this game and now I'm just at the top of the world. It was always like a small climb with little bumps going up in there and dips. So it was a gradual upwards trend instead of like, I'm now the fighting game, you know, Fortnite guy or something. We've never had a game that's been that, I'd say, impactful to launch somebody into the stratosphere. Combat Path 08 says, the arcades were such an important part to the FGC and are still integral overseas. Do you think there is ever a future where arcades thrive again in the US, or in any way that isn't just seen as novelty? Harsh reality question, because unfortunately, no. When we talk about arcades as a business and as like, you know, oh, if people are going to show up and create arcades again and allow for that venue, that space to exist, it's always going to be niche kind of from this point forward. And that just comes down to like logistics. The reason arcades were interesting back in the day is because they were offering the most premium video game experience you could have, those of which could not be emulated at home, you know? So you went to the arcade to experience what is new in this like revolution. That just isn't really around much anymore. Now it's obviously like a communal thing. We're just gonna get together and we're gonna share some drinks or some food. We're gonna go to like a local or a barcade that just has some setups. Now it's Cheers, right? And I'm dating myself by using that reference, but it's Cheers. You're just gonna go to some place where everybody knows your name and you're just in there for the same reason as everybody else, sharing the same interest. So I've treated my content the same way with streaming, where it's like, yeah, I wanna feel like this is the Cheers with all these friends and we're all here and we're hanging out together. But if we're talking about arcades like as like a business again, I don't think that's coming back because we got everything in our pockets, we got everything at home, the most premium and experiences are there. And nowadays, like the arcade version of Street Fighter 6 is like one of the worst versions. Like it isn't particularly great. I wish it could come back, but I think it just comes down to if you have those places and you know they exist, to support them. If you recognize that they're there, look into it, and it'll take some effort. It takes some effort to jump into the FGC when you're trying to, you know, educate yourself about a game or a scene or something like that. But I think I boil it down to just support your locals. Keyblade Dragon has a question. How does someone even begin to learn fighting games? How is it even possible to memorize every character having completely different buttons and commands? I can hardly remember one character's moves, let alone a whole roster. Many people come to me with these sort of like generalized question. How do I learn how to play fighting games? Which fighting game do I play? And my answer is usually the same to everything that is sort of generalized. You just need to fall in love with something, dude. Most of the competitive players we know, and as you watch like either myself or people that do this stuff for a living, didn't inherently get into fighting games because they looked at it as like a task list where it's like, all right, I don't know the Alpha 2 matchup between Ken versus Sagat. I gotta learn all of Gen's moves. I gotta figure out the frame data. We just approached it because we liked it. And it's just a cool game to play. So when you're in that situation, and you're just jiving with something. I mean, I think we all have had this moment where you run into a game and all of a sudden you're competent at it and you're good and you're able to hold down against other people that are good, but that wasn't your intention. Your intention was that you were just playing a cool game. That was fun. That's kind of the goal of fighting games, in my opinion, from like a developer side. Just create a game that is like fun, that is really interesting and captivating and has enough content that will get you to jump that gap to go play online because you fell in love with something or a character or something like that. So if you look at it that way, just find that fighting game that does it for you. Find that one or those characters that really do it for you. And you won't even have to think about learning the other matchups. You won't even have to think about learning the frame data. You're just gonna play the game and naturally absorb that stuff to the point where, oh damn, now you're good. Now you actually like didn't even think of oh, I don't know how to fight this matchup in Tekken 8 or something like that. You just fought it enough in ranked or whatever that you're just sort of familiar with what that character does without, having to specifically go on the grind set mindset. Capt Nizik says, was there ever a moment where fighting games clicked in my head? I feel like I've plateaued for a while and I've been struggling to understand some core elements in fighting games as a whole. Yeah, there's a couple of moments for me personally, and one of them goes all the way back to, I'd say, Super Street Fighter 2 on the Genesis. I learned how to do like special moves, right? For the first time, never understood how these special moves work. It was sort of this enigmatic feature that they just randomly happen for the majority of people back in the day. But I realized, I roll my hand across. That I remember that moment clicking and I was like, what? And the Tatsu, I just do the other way. The Dragon Punch, that doesn't make any sense. Why is it a Z motion? But then I just realized, it's forward and then fire. It always works now. That was a big like epiphany moment for me personally. Not many other folks are gonna run into that now. It's kind of like given information. Having a character click with you is also another big thing. And there's been a couple of moments like that for me. One was Strider in Marvel vs. Capcom 1. The character gave me the drive to want to learn more because they just looked so cool at what they did. And obviously, Ken in Street Fighter 3 Third Strike and Fulgore in Killer Instinct. Some of these characters just did it for me so much that I was motivated to want to just be as good as I possibly could be, to put as much time into there as possible. Yeah, finding that moment and when it clicks and identifying it is probably not going to be obvious to anybody in the moment, but with some retrospect, you'll realize like, that's when it happened. Daniel Julian asks, how do you calm yourself from stress? Content creation is stressful in itself for fighting games. So what would you recommend to people that struggle with the stresses of fighting games and like FGC stuff and fighting game players? Yeah, and I think this comes down to like a ranked anxiety situation where you're sort of just nervous about performing. I will say, personally, there is more pressure on individuals and players and content creators just to inherently be super good at all times and for you not even to see that process. I try not to put myself in that space nearly as much because it can be just extremely daunting. If you're kind of expecting yourself just to jump into something and be good at it without experience, then what are we doing, man? Like, no, the process is what's interesting. Getting to that certain point, achieving micro goals throughout it is important. I actively recognize that within myself, I can only get so good at any of the individual games I play because within my space, there's only so much time allotment I can put into each game. And that's been the case for 10 years, and it's had an impact on me mentally of just like, I like flopping between games. One gets kind of like, stale after a little while. I want to flip to something else to be reminded why that other game before was so good, or the other game might be good. Don't put those expectations on yourself, is all I'm trying to say. And even for me personally, I want to show people the process. That's kind of why I like highlighting and emphasizing some training mode stuff, that this can be fun. Like, look at us discover this like sandbox, this toolkit a character has. We're gonna get into it, decide it, figure it out, discover some things, watch what other people are doing, try to implement that into ours. Like, that's really fun to do without spending too much time doing that, That's a really important thing for me. I try to put myself in the eyes and the heads of players that are just trying to get into this a lot. So one of the goals of my personal style of content nowadays is to show that process and to show like, where the neurons are firing, where the connections are being established, and how long does it take to eventually get to a point where you're able to land it in online matches and even apply that stuff, because that's an entirely different, operation that goes on in your head. Secret Seashell says, how important to the health of the fighting game community is remembering, maintaining, and playing classic fighting games? It's everything, dude. That's a great question, because I have made it an absolute point to go back and look at where we have been, either how bad it was or how good it was, and put that directly in comparison to where we are now. As much as we are absolutely burdened by perspective, those of us that have been doing this for like almost 20 years, it's really important. And I think this has happened a lot in the modern fighting game space where, not everything is absolutely perfect, and things aren't always going to be squeaky clean. Nothing will ever be. Nothing will ever be able to emulate your like peak fighting game. That is just going to be an impossible standard that you set yourself up for. But there is like mini victories in there with a lot of the ways the community has gone, much less the fighting games themselves in our relationship with the developers. We're in a kind of a good spot right now. And in comparison to where we were in not even like 10 years ago, it was kind of rough for a lot of games with like online play. Now it feels like developers are directly connected to us in several fashions. That's good. And the only reason we have that is like classic fighting games teach us that lesson, that we have the perspective of why it was so good here. And we're starting to see that actually reflected in some new games that come out where it's like, the influence of this older game is felt in this new game. It's clear that they wanted to do something unique and different. That's why they're going this route, because everyone talked about this in Tekken 7 or, Street Fighter 5, Street Fighter 4, all that kind of stuff. That had an impact. So identifying those impacts and getting those like little victories is kind of something that I really like highlighting. Dante, Eye of the Tower, asks, how crucial do you believe that single-player content is to the survival and success of fighting games going forward, considering the success that franchises like Street Fighter and Mortal Kombat have had with single-player content in their games? Extremely important. It's difficult now to ask full price for a fighting game that effectively just has online training room and an arcade mode. That, in my opinion, is kind of an arcade game still. This is like just a port of an arcade game, even though there's no arcade version. Fighting games have kind of been stuck in that mentality and that design philosophy for quite a long time, while others have deviated from it, NetherRealm, and even Tekken to a certain degree, with a ton of single-player content.
This should be a mode, Farming Simulator, Mortal Kombat. Let's go! Yeah.
That tries to get people into the game inherently without having you to go online. I think the relationship here is that fighting games need something for you to immediately fall in love with, to immediately be interested in, to bridge that gap. And yeah, things like Smash Brothers have been pretty good at that in the past, where it's just a ton of content and a ton of things you can do before you try to go find people to play. But if you have something that is just like so cool and you enjoy it so much and man, this was so much fun, you jump that gap in your head. You do that just naturally through the process of falling in love with a character or falling in love with a game or something like that. For me, speaking going forward, yes, like single player content is really important. And I think most devs understand this now because it's obviously a much bigger priority than it ever has been before, at least with like the big three. And even some of the smaller fighting games that are like showing up and coming back, yeah, they usually give you something to sort of like bite into that isn't just slamming your head against ranked matchmaking. Deku Dude Quad 8 says, are we in or about to be in a fighting game renaissance? With a lot of classics being re-released and new games constantly coming out and being supported, what is the best way for the FGC itself to follow this boom? So I believe we are. I believe like the majority of games that we have right now are either in a really good space where they work online, have a relatively healthy competitive scene, function very well as games. They're not just like inherently either like super boring or kind of crazy where they're just way too over the top. Some push things pretty far, but at the same point, I think that's just because the player base we have is just so much bigger. We have so much more exposure to better players and high level competition than ever before. So it's like you reach what is kind of the competitive maximum of a game much faster than we have in the past. So I do think we're at a renaissance right now because it feels like everything's coming back. The moment it was solidified was when Marvel vs. Capcom returned, where seemingly out of nowhere, a franchise that so many people love, including myself, was just kind of dead and gone, suddenly was back. And it was like, wait a minute, this shouldn't be possible. These games have not been available since the 90s. That made me realize, especially with the reaction that happened after, we're living in kind of special times right now. It's the same thing I talked about at the end of Smash Brothers Smash Ultimate, where like Sakurai's working on this game that has like nearly 100 characters in it with a franchise beyond the lights of which we ever seen before. I'm like, dude, this is never gonna happen again. Like, this is such a special time in this little like nook of the community to recognize that and like cherish it. I think we're kind of going through that right now with fighting games. Is it gonna last forever? I don't know, but at least from the FGC side of things, we eatin', dude. Tournaments feel bigger than they ever have been. They feel a lot different because so much is focused around online play, and a lot of like the personal beefs and rivalries that would happen at locals isn't kind of there anymore. And, you know, clearly big corporations are getting involved in a huge variety of ways. And it has allowed us to grow exponentially fast. This is the stuff that we were all screaming and asking for the early 2000s on srk.com. There's enough new fighting games and enough new stuff where it's not gonna last forever, you know? Everyone has to find their niche within this space, but in terms of content creation and tournaments and where we are in relation to it, it feels like almost every single year there's new games and new tournaments and brand new things to keep up with, and barely even I can keep up with it all. JPEG8314 says, what fighting game series do you want a sequel of? Killer Instinct. It's been 11 years, man. I lost a year in there. It's been 11 years. Personally speaking, I'm just like, how did we not get a sequel to KI at some point in there? It was like one of that generation's Xbox's biggest games. That's one that hits me a lot. And if there's few fighting game franchises that I can always champion, it's going to be Marvel vs. Capcom and KI. And MVC, I feel like, is in a pretty good spot right now. We're almost at, any moment in the next year or two, Marvel could come back again. With Killer Instinct, I don't know. It's kind of hard to tell with the way that company's working. So if there's anything I can do to get a sequel to KI in some way and get, maybe some of the original devs on it to make some more KI, man, I would do almost anything. This is coming from Davi D4769. Now that Marvel vs. Capcom and Capcom vs. SNK are back, what retro fighting games would you like to see a re-release? I imagine Tekken 5 or Soul Calibur 2. Good question. And you actually mentioned the two that immediately popped ahead. Yeah, a Tekken collection would be great. Soul Calibur specifically had a couple re-releases, with Soul Calibur 1 on Xbox 360 and Soul Calibur 2 not that long after. And they were okay ports. Never really had good online, which was kind of the unfortunate part. Soul Calibur's been a series that has never had an opportunity to really have great online play. And I would love for that to be the case. I think that would be awesome if there was somehow a re-release of those old games, Tekken 3, especially Tekken 5 DR. It would just be cool to have those exist in some way. But in the similar fashion, the old Mortal Kombat series, dude, there's some of these old games that are still crazy to me that they're kind of unacquirable unless you go find cartridges and discs from PlayStation 1 era, dude. Yeah, for me personally, older Tekken games, the Soul Calibur series, as well as Mortal Kombat. And some of the classic MK games, I think they definitely need to come back in some way. Nizama7 asks, how important are your main characters to you? And can you describe your relationship with them? Deep and personal. It means a lot. In fact, characters are the things that got me into competitive fighting games, period. And how cool characters were, how much I liked them. We talked a bit about earlier with Strider and Fulgore and Ken and stuff like that. I think making that connection with a character and sort of getting the the Pacific Rim, synchronization moment of you being able to execute those ideas and concepts and moves through a character where you're almost simpatico with them. And the execution process therein feels so good when you eventually get there, when you get close to being there, where it's oh, now I'm not even thinking about what I'm doing, I am just acting, right? So it's proper Tetris flow state type stuff. That feels so good, man. And sometimes how much I play a game will depend entirely on how much I jive with the characters in that game, much less one or two characters. And there's been several games in the past couple years that's happened. For example, let's use DNF Duel, a cool game with a lot of crazy stuff in it. But they had this troubleshooter guy, and this troubleshooter guy was effectively the Predator from Mortal Kombat X, and he had traps and all this stuff, and you would explode the traps, and I was whoa, he's Hunter Predator, but for some reason he looks like this dude. He looks super cool. So I really got into it, and it's man, and I got to the highest rank of the game, and that's just because I was inspired by one character just to continue to play. And granted, that game might not be the most popular or anything like that. I found a reason to get in and continue to play. So for me personally, characters are almost everything, man. If a game can be incredible to play, I'll just be in a character crisis because this game is super good, but I just haven't found one that I can gel with yet. And you just had to find that one and make that connection.